In the last class, I introduced a schema for anthropology in general. Basically, rehearsing our big idea from the early days of anthropology, which probably made us into the cool people that we are, that our learned behavior, our culture, is a bigger deal than our biology as expressed in race, sex, etc. However, the practice of anthropology has often been mostly elite peeps, mostly white guys, studying people who were, in the words of Jones, anthropology and the oppressed, but people who were represented as others. Now, in Bernard Perley's article, he talks a lot about a person named, or he draws on a person named Fabian, Johannes Fabian's work, which most of the time I can't understand what Fabian is saying. I want to understand, but I can't. But he had some good blocks of text. As Fabian argues, historically and theoretically, our subject matter has been peoples we represented as an other. Then he has a sentence that maybe doesn't make sense in our time. He says that this is in constant danger of evaporating into clouds of fashionable talk about othering. But he says that it's regrettable that we represented folks as an other, but it made it so that anthropology had to at least encounter somebody, that they had to get outside of themselves. It was not a good idea that they represented the other people that they were studying. He has another block quote on page 258, is that they would talk about them as if they were in a time other than that of the one who talks. So that anthropologists would go to study people, and then when they would talk about them or represent them, they would represent them as if they were in a different time period. But the fact of the matter was that anthropologists actually had to and still have to go and talk to people in their present time. Even if they represent them as not, they have to talk to people who are sharing their present time period. And so what Fabi is saying is anthropologists do what they do by doing it with others. He says perhaps sometimes onto others, but there has to be an other out there. And I think what Fabian is saying is, as bad as anthropology can be at representing those others, at least you have to talk to somebody who is outside of yourself to do that. Now, we talked about how in native anthropology, those folks have mostly been charged with studying people in their own group, for better or worse. But that is the way things have been. And in this Perley article, he's, as we'll talk about, he's talking about how that works for someone who is both an anthropologist and a native. I mentioned that there has also been a turn to mostly white people or mostly elites studying the powerful, and an attempt to understand the structures of power rather than just studying the marginalized. I said in the last class, and I still think it's true, that what anthropology has not permitted to have happen, or that our society perhaps doesn't permit to have happen, is that marginal people can study powerful people. That just doesn't work. You don't see anthropologists from other places showing up in the United States and studying us. It just hardly ever happens. If it does, people don't even talk to them. I don't know that it happens. Sometimes, but it really isn't prominent in anthropology. And so even people who look very different from me in anthropology are usually studying people who look like them or other marginalized peoples. You don't have this other thing going on. Now, I want to start out with this article from the called Fieldwork and Shared Spaces, Positionality, Power, and Ethics of Citizen Anthropologists in Southern Africa by Heike Becker, Emile Boonzaier, and Joy Owen. So on the one hand, there has been this tendency, along with white studying the powerful, of this idea that people are studying at home. So you can do your anthropology at home. And in this sense, Becker, Boonzaier, and Owen are all citizens of a nation state in South Africa, maybe South Africa itself, but around there, let us say, Southern Africa. And so in some ways, you could say that they are doing anthropology at home. However, what they are saying is that the schema doesn't fit. That schema that I just drew doesn't fit them because, yes, they are studying at home technically, but they are studying people who are not members of the same sociocultural community. And so they don't think this really works or applies to them because although it is at home, it is citizens studying other citizens. They find more helpful the idea of citizen anthropology that comes to us from Angela Cheater. And this idea is that you are a fellow citizen studying people who are not necessarily in the same sociocultural space, and you then have ethical responsibilities. They say it's actually difficult, though, to do this. It raises all kinds of ethical concerns because the people who you are studying want to have something good happen because of your research. They want it to be used. And at least one of them, Becker, says that in terms of, she calls it the fallacies of applied anthropology, that it hardly, if ever, resulted in improvements that benefited the local population. Like I said, this article raises a number of issues about who anthropologists are. I went looking for pictures of all the authors. I could only find pictures of two of them. On the one hand, you could probably slot this into the idea of still elites studying others who are marginalized, but it's closer to home within another society. I don't think in Southern Africa, to my knowledge, or in many of these places, you have the marginalized studying the powerful. I still don't think that is really happening here, but they are correct that it is different when people are citizens and you are studying other citizens instead of going further away. Now, they say that this is hardly ever talked about. We have seen this before in an article that everybody loved called Anthropologies of the South. And this article was perhaps one of our more incomprehensible articles, but one of the third points, or one of the points the author made in this article was that it's different when you're studying your own citizens. And he was talking mostly about Latin America, but in some ways, he was saying something quite similar to what our authors today are saying. Esteban Kratz, Anthropologists of the South. So he was talking mostly about Latin America, but he says that there are political implications when you have one citizen of a country studying perhaps in a different cultural area, but they're still citizens. And so they have political and economic implications for this. I would say that as we turn to our next author, Bernard Perley, and Indigenous Anthropology in the Americas, I do wonder if it is so different. In the United States, for example, you had anthropologists like Lewis Henry Morgan and Franz Boas who were studying Native Americans, who were also citizens of the United States. So, and in some ways, we're close to home. The idea that anthropologists have to go far away has become rather common, but I'm not sure why we can't draw lessons from the US, the experience of anthropology in the United States, because that was done with people who are indigenous or Native Americans and also citizens. And so that brings us to Bernard Perley's article called Gone Anthropologist. When he says gone anthropologist, he went from an architect. He was studying architecture. But you wouldn't say gone architect. No. Why does he say gone anthropologist? You probably don't know this. He's making a joke, actually. What's the stereotype about anthropologists when they go somewhere and they go into a community it's not even joke about anthropologists. It's a joke about white people who go into some other place and all of a sudden they're wearing the beads and they're going native, right? And so he's making a joke back, right? That oftentimes anthropologists and others are accused of going native or gone native, and you're not supposed to do that. But he is a native who has, maybe people are making fun of him for having gone anthropologist, and he can't understand him anymore because then he's talking about epistemic slippage. And then you're like, wait a second, what the heck, man? We can't even understand what you're talking about anymore. What's epistemic slippage? I think he's actually arguing for it, right? That in some ways, this is a good idea, that you shouldn't necessarily separate these things as much as they are often separated. But it is hard to understand. And like I said, he heavily draws on Johannes Fabian's work, and oftentimes I can't understand what he is saying here. Like I said, what Fabian is saying is that there was a representation of natives as living in another time and another place. Page 258, the discourse places others not only in another time, but also in another place, thereby relegating other epistemes to secondary status. So I think what Fabian is saying is that was the problem, is the relegation of those other ways of knowledge into secondary status. But Fabian is also again saying that at least anthropologists had to work and acknowledge that they were in a community of knowers. They had to at least talk to people. They had to, unlike other disciplines, they had to be somewhere, and they had to talk to people and have this communication. Even if they were represented as others, they still had to be at the others. Like I said, in some ways, Perley is telling us that you have this disjunction between academic texts, which can't be understood by the community, and the stuff that is useful to the community. He seems to, in some ways, do that in here because we can't understand all what he's saying. There is a picture of a lecture he gave a couple years ago, Whose Home and Whose Native Land? And when you're talking to him in the present, it makes more sense. In some ways, what does he want to do with his work? He says he additionally produced sort of these very academic works and very community-centered works, but they were still separate. And so then these art installations, he says he wants to bring it together and have it so that, as he says, the installation can be experienced by anthropologists as an ethnographic space, while members of the Maliseet community can experience it as a sacred space. Most important, both audiences can experience the installations as ethnographic and sacred space simultaneously. So they can get both together. And so I wish I went searching for this installation space. I couldn't find it, but I did find an article in Urban Milwaukee on how Bernard Perley mixes anthropology and art. This exhibit on visualizing sovereignty, which did look super cool.